So now we're just going to have a brief presentation by Ed Berry to talk about the Sustainable Living Planner that Don alluded to in his presentation. This is going to be about a 5-minute presentation. I'll just give you a little background about Ed. Ed is the Sustainable Living Advisor at the Population Institute. He's also the Director of the Sustainable World Initiative and serves on the Board of Advisors for Environmental Foundation International. He was formerly the Chief Operating Officer for the Global Footprint Network. Prior to his work in the nonprofit sector, he was a business manager for a major energy corporation. Ed has a BS in chemistry and engineering from Michigan State University, and again, he'll be discussing his environmental living planner. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you, Leah. Actually, I'm not going to do that. Sorry. Something close. Actually, Leah asked me to tell you a bit about our efforts to get sustainability concepts into government. And this is really just one example and maybe a segue into the next item on the agenda, which I think is really important, is to get some more dialogue about what we're going to be doing next, or what we might possibly do. So I'm actually going to not tell you about the Sustainable Living Planner. I think Don did a nice job. And I can certainly, and also not tell you about the Sustainable World Initiative, because we have ample written information. Any of you who are interested in the activities of the Sustainable World Initiative, we would love to share with you some written information after this meeting, and I'd love to dialogue with you in the future. But right now what I'd like to do is to just skip ahead in my prepared presentation and just make a point that I think you've already sort of heard, but I want to make it in a little different way. And that is that Chris really talked to you about how the next 20 years are going to be different than the last 20 years, how we're in for a major change. And I want to suggest to you that we've really already experienced a great transformation. In terms of the relationship between humans and nature, we did something rather dramatic in the late 19th century. And that is, we went into fundamental resource overshoot. Well, 1950 to 1990. 20th century, I'm sorry. Right. And if you think about that, it just has all sorts of policy ramifications. Now this chart, which is very comparable to what Don showed you in detail, shows that back in around 1960, humanity was using about half of the ecological resources. These are the renewable ecological resources of nature. But the trend was very strongly moving up. And now this is the situation. And I would add to this chart that this situation, the research question presented in this graph doesn't have anything to do with conservation. In other words, there's no allocation of biodiversity or biological resources for other species. This is simply anthropogenic demand versus anthropogenic capacity at the prevailing technologies. So the curve is actually much worse than that if you consider that we have to allocate some biodiversity to other species. So in summary, in the latter part of this century, the 20th century, the human scale of activity became so large that we fundamentally changed the world. Thanks to our great ingenuity and to our power over nature, we drove the reality of earthly existence into resource overshoot. Now, let me ask, is there anyone in this room that doesn't think we're in overshoot? Good, I don't have to spend much time convincing you. But typically what we do with audiences that don't think we're in resource overshoot, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to see, is we say, you know, there are really three ways that we can demonstrate this. One is we can simply open our eyes and look at what we're doing to nature and to our renewable resources, to our fisheries, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. The second way is we can use indicators, economic indicators, like the Genuine Progress Indicator, which has been adjusted for natural resource externalities, if you will. And most of those indicators, when compared to gross domestic product, go through a divergence around this same period of time. And that's a real clear indicator that, hey, we are over-consuming natural resources. The third way, of course, is to do it just this way, and that is to use metrics like the ecological footprint to actually plot it and calculate it. So let's just think a minute about the ramifications of this. The empty world scenario, which existed prior to this time, it really can accommodate completely open and free migration. An Oklahoma land rush fits this model, as does the image of the U.S. as a great melting pot nation that welcomes all people who wish to land on our shores. But melting pot scenarios and mass migration as a paradigm for improving prosperity don't necessarily fit in an overshoot world. In fact, the fundamental shift to overconsumption of available planetary resources has many policy implications. As we've already mentioned, our growth paradigm needs to be re-examined, and we need to conceptualize and create a more sustainable economic system. We also need to invest now more in where we have the real limitations, and that means investing in natural capital rather than man-made capital. Lastly, we must urgently reduce our resource footprint. We need to adopt policies and make sizable investments in all the PAT sectors that accomplish this. We need to eliminate overconsumption and move towards total recycle. We need to invest heavily in energy efficiency and renewable clean energy technologies, and most importantly, we need to stabilize and ultimately reduce human numbers. I'm not going to go through, again in the interest of time, the three ethical issues that are raised and really exacerbated by a clear situation of overshoot. The interspecies allocation, which Don has talked well about, eloquently about. The international allocation, which is the north-south social equity issue. And the intergenerational allocation of scarce resources. How many do we use up and then future generations don't have access to? But to say that all of these ethical issues can be addressed positively if we adopt practices of designing for sustainability. In other words, having every nation in the world evaluate, report, and plan for a resource-balanced world. Now, you might be thinking that our government already does this, but let me assure you, when we've looked at the federal government, we see no job description that includes something like, are we on a sustainable environmental course? So they're really not, this macro balancing idea of determining whether or not we're sustainable is just not happening. And right now, we're involved in a couple of projects to get this concept into national governance, and also we're working with the United Nations processes to get it into the international global environmental governance systems. And that's pretty much what I had to say in a nutshell, except maybe to make a transition to just a couple of personal experiences that relate to the issue here. And that is that I had the opportunity to teach a class at State University of New York a year and a half ago. It was an environmental economics course. And one of the things I realized as I was dealing with glassy-eyed students was that there really isn't a good understanding that everything we do economically has natural resource consequences. That what you all understand, that everything we do in terms of producing goods and services requires natural resources of one form or another. Students didn't necessarily get that concept or that connection. So to me, that is sort of an awareness challenge number one. The next challenge is that the scale of the economy is really related to sustainability. There's so much discussion about sustainable development, but not the broad concept of sustainability. So there's a disconnect there too. Next, there's a disconnect between sustainability and population. We all know that population is often not mentioned in the sustainability discussion, and it's not part of the solution. Lastly, of course, that people don't necessarily understand that population numbers are very much a function of how we manage immigration. So when you put all these together, and you try to connect immigration with natural resources, I think it's grist for thought about how we can actually do that when there are actually 4 awareness challenges. And I will leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been such an interesting conference. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take questions. I mean, if there are some final thoughts that people have, I just wanted to wrap up by saying, first of all, thank you to all of our speakers. Really, really appreciate all the time and effort in having you here. Also, thank you to Bill Ryerson for helping to coordinate this, Phil Cafaro, and especially my assistant, Rachel McCann. I know she can't hear me right now, but just grateful for all of that. And that this is going to be an annual conference that we hold. So we're hoping that you'll take interest in this and consider coming back next year. And if you have any interest in our work, please check out our website. It's pfirdc.org. We're a small organization. We're always looking for funding, so just to keep that in mind. So thank you very much. Thank you, Leah.